So I'm going to begin with noticing technology has changed. I was explaining to my daughter the other day that answering machines are different than they used to be. Do you remember when they used to be those portable things next to the phone? Yeah, and they would have like a digit, they have a number of the number of calls you received, and if it was full, it would go. The light would blink more, depending. Maybe you didn't have the same machine I did. Anyway, I remember when I would go back to the church after I'd been out visiting, and I would always, first thing I'd unlock the door and I would look in to see, did I get any calls, right? And I would see what the number would be, and I would see how fast it was blinking. And I'll remember this particular week in a particular church because there were a lot of messages that week, and they were all coming from the same person, right? And this person was filling up the answering machine with very long messages, yes? And he had a good sense of humor because I once told him, you know, your messages are very long. And he said, just like your sermons. Boom. Anyway, I got in the message, and there was these very long messages. And what he was telling me on the message, this man who lived not far from the church, is that he had been hearing a voice, a still small voice, calling him to start coming to our church. Not this church, another church. And he wanted to know if it was a safe space for him. He wanted to know if it was a place where he could come without judgment, that he would feel God's love and grace. And so we went for coffee, and I explained to him that I was quite confident that he would be well received. He explained to me that in his life there had been quite a journey, up and down, up and down. He'd grown up in a small town where he had done quite well for himself. He had been married young, had children, was in a number of different groups, had lots of hobbies, life was good. At a certain point in his life, he was diagnosed with an illness, a mental illness. And this was something that he had never experienced before, and it took quite a while for him to find his way. In the meantime, he also developed certain addictions that he used to kind of medicate himself. So his very complex life, which included a diagnosis, included some addiction challenges, and some changes in personality. And suddenly, in his life, some of the things that he had come to rely on were disappearing. Friends were harder to maintain. People's patience with him was dwindling. His family became very frustrated, and ultimately he became divorced. His children also found it difficult to be with him. His employer put him on long-term disability. And when he walked down the street or when he would go to church, people would look at him with one eye, kind of, Or at least that's the way he felt. So he decided that for him, he needed to move from a place where he felt constantly ashamed and shamed to a place where perhaps he could be and no one would know who he was. So he moved to a larger place. The plus of that was that he began to feel less judged, less shame. The negative was he didn't have any support. And that's when he started to hear the voice. Come to my house. Come to my house. So he looked out his apartment building, and the only church that was right there in his line of vision was the church where I was. But he wasn't sure, and he was nervous. So in our coffee and conversation that the two of us shared, I encouraged him to start slow. Sit in the pews. Move slowly. Get trust. Start to meet one or two people. Build relationship. Volunteer. Our reading this morning of Zacchaeus is a story of someone who also feels ashamed and shame. It was mentioned that he stole. But let me explain a little bit more about what tax collectors would have meant for that society. And I've said this before, but it bears repeating, because in our culture, we tend to hear in 2019 language and not understand the total context. So we're not keen on paying taxes generally. Is that fair? Yeah. And so someone being a tax collector or working for CRA or whatever wouldn't necessarily be, popular. But in this particular case, it's worse. Because what the Roman Empire did to maintain complete and total control over the Jews was very cunning. They employed other Jews to take taxes from their own people, and then with the money employ a police state with people who would spy on each other. It was very cunning. And these particular persons, these Jews, would be hated by their fellow Jews because they were seen as collaborators with the Roman Empire. But it gets worse. In addition to taking the money from their own people for this kind of empire, they also took a little bit more. They were cheating, right? And thus, everywhere the Zacchaeus would go, despite being relatively well off financially, his own people would look at him and walk away. He lived a wealthy life, but a lonely life. And no doubt, in a small place such as where he was, he would have heard about someone who sat and ate with persons who had imperfect lives. One of the great accusations made about Jesus was that he hung out with sinners, people who had imperfect lives. He would sit with them, eat with them, drink with them, and this drove the religious establishment crazy, because you were not supposed to be with people who had imperfect, impure lives. Shame was a tremendous impediment to socialization. You could be poor and ashamed, and you could be rich and ashamed. But shame is shame, and it isolates, and it removes. And so ashamed is Zacchaeus in this story that watching Jesus and hearing him and seeing him, which would be a wonderfully healing feeling to someone who needs to know that there is someone anywhere who would understand and love him, would have to be from some distance. So the tree, right? He was up in the tree. The story is that Jesus is looking and sees this man in the tree and welcomes him down. One of the commentators that I read in this text refers to people like Zacchaeus as lurkers. Now, that's a term that doesn't always have a positive impact on the internet, you know? But people who are at a distance because they don't know that if they come closer, you will move further away. So they keep their distance. My mother, my late mother, who I referred to as loving music, taught me many things. But she always said to me, wherever you go, Kevin, wherever you go, if there's a crowd of people, there will always be people further away, at a distance, because they don't know if they belong. You know what I mean? They're at the distance. I often wonder, when I get invited to a meeting, sometimes I get invited to speak at anniversary Sundays, yeah? I've been around so long, and the list is so short that eventually you have to ask me, right? I've come to the point now where all churches are at the point where, who are we going to have for anniversary? Well, we've had everybody else. I suppose we should have Kevin. So I get invited often. And one of the things that I always notice when I come is that there are always, whether it's in the church or out in the hall, there are always people on the margin, yeah? Out there. And my mother used to say that when you walk in a room, the impulse is to talk to the people right in front of you. Reject that impulse and go back and talk to the folk who are furthest away. Because, as my mother would often say, these are folk who probably, right, have each other. They are folk who don't. And that is something that I learned from her. Jesus understood this as part of the Jewish law and understood this as his vocation as Lord and Savior, to reach beyond the accepted and find those. Luke's gospel is constantly on us about reaching out into people on the street, people in the ditch, lost coins, lost sons, right? Always reaching. And that's what Jesus does. He invites him down from the tree. And we are told, when Karen was reading, at the very end, the promise is that you will inherit and be reminded that you are a son of Abraham. You are part of a long tree, a family tree that connects us to the very beginning of creation. We are all God's children. So fast forward, the gentleman whom I referenced, he joined the church. He joined the choir. And because he understood shame better than any of us, he would always be aware in church, at our social gatherings, someone who was lurking in the back, who needed blessing. And he would often say to me, he would come up to me and he would say, "You see that person in the back? I think they need a blessing." Because if you felt shame, you could empathize. This past week, I had this story of Zacchaeus racing through my mind all week. And I happened to be at a church early one morning, and standing outside the church was a woman singing. And I wasn't sure what she was singing, but I knew it was something familiar. And I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. But she was singing, "And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. I said to myself, I know that peace. And then she sang, I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And then she sang the refrain. And then she really mustered up the voice, and I could see people, it was a busy street, people were stopping, and they were listening. And she said, he speaks, and the sound of his voice is so sweet the birds hush their singing, and the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. So I stopped and I said, that's a beautiful song. She said, I'm just waiting for someone to stop and offer me a blessing. So we held hands, and I shared a blessing with her. And she said, thank you. She said, life's been pretty rough. And I've been standing here singing, waiting for someone to talk to me. And the thing about persons like that woman is that they've reached a point in their shame where they just don't care anymore. Yeah? But most of us are where she is, but we're a little bit more, careful. Yeah? So we're a little bit more poised. We're a little bit more polished. But I think there are times where all of us get to that point where we need to deal with whatever it is that we're shame or that vulnerability that's welling up, and we need to know that we're loved. And we need to listen to that little voice, or that voice that calls us to come down. All of us. Amen.